Hi, today I'm going to be talking about the SSRI class of drugs. They're antidepressants and anxiolytics. So I'm going to go over the history a bit, and I'll also get into individual SSRIs and the pros and cons of each. I'm sorry if I get specific details wrong. It is off the top of my head, I'm not reading anything, but I believe the information to be correct. I've researched these drugs for hours and hours on my own time. I have personal experience with them, some of them, and also a large majority of my undergrad in university had to do with pharmacology. It was one of my special interests, so I've spent quite a bit of time researching these drugs. So I'm just going to go over the history of SSRIs first and why they were considered revolutionary in the antidepressant field. So SSRIs stand for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Previously, before the SSRIs, which I think arose in 1989, starting with Prozac, I believe. Before that, you had tricyclic antidepressants like imipramine, clomipramine, amitriptyline, like Elavil. And they were effective antidepressants, but they were considered dirty drugs. Dirty drugs in the sense that they weren't selective. So, for instance, SSRIs are selective for the serotonin receptors, and tricyclic antidepressants are as well. The molecule will go and bind to the serotonin transporter, but they're messy and dirty in the sense that they also bind to many other different receptors in the brain that aren't really responsible for the effects. For instance, they would bind to muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, and they would cause things like very bad dry mouth, dilated pupils. You would feel like you were going to faint when you stand up quickly. So, these effects didn't really add to the antidepressant value of the drug. They were just kind of useless side effects just because the drug is non-selective and binding to these other receptors besides the serotonin. It also bound to norepinephrine, which is considered a good thing, and SSRIs don't, but they have another class of drugs called SNRIs, which are the cleaner form of tricyclics as well. So the SNRIs, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, will bind to both serotonin receptors and to norepinephrine receptors, and they try to avoid things like binding to muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, which, like I said, gives the side effects. So I'm just going to go over how SSRIs work. So if you imagine a nerve cell in your brain looks like this. This is the body. It looks like, I'm sure you've seen pictures, it looks like this splattered egg kind of thing. So here's the cell body. My fingers are the dendrites, which are small little appendages that reach out and make contact with other nerve cells. And my arm would be the axon. And if my arm just ended like this is the axon terminal. And an adjacent cell would generally look like this. So here's another nerve cell, and it's making contact, or almost making contact with the previous nerve cell's axon. And either they bind to the dendrites or the cell body. So what happens in between, this is the important part, the microscopic little tiny space in between a nerve cell and a previous nerve cell's axon. So neurotransmitters are substances that transmit information from one nerve cell to the next. Different neurotransmitters have different effects. There's norepinephrine, serotonin, like I said, muscarinic, acetylcholine. So these have differing effects on the postsynaptic cell. So the axon will spit out these substances. It'll go and bind to the dendrites or the cell body on the cell next to it. And depending on the area in the brain, depending on which receptors are actually on the other cell, depending on the neurotransmitter itself, sometimes they'll activate the cell and they'll make that cell fire like a kind of chain reaction, or they could actually have another effect where they inhibit it. They make this secondary cell less likely to fire into the next cell. So that would be more of an inhibitory response, whereas an excitatory response would be if they made the postsynaptic cell fire. So serotonin can actually do both, depends on which serotonin receptors they touch. So basically what an SSRI does is you'll see Zoloft commercials that'll say, like, depression is believed to be, it implies that depression is a lack of neurotransmitters, and that Zoloft corrects this chemical imbalance. And you see in the new picture, and the Zoloft is spitting out, it's making the synapse, making it spit out more serotonin, but it doesn't really work like that. SSRIs work through a different mechanism. So basically, your body says, it's a waste to just spit out the serotonin into the synapse and just have this little signaling telling what the next cell to do. It's a waste if it just spits it out and it activates or inhibits and then just gets rid of the serotonin, right? Serotonin is manufactured in the axon terminal of one of the nerve cells. So it spits out serotonin, it has the signaling effect in the other cell. And then, your body says, okay, well, it's a waste. We don't need that serotonin there in the synapse anymore. I've already told that nerve cell to fire or not fire. So what it actually does, instead of just having it degrade, instead of just making more and more serotonin in the axon to just spit out and have a waste, the axon will actually have a tiny little protein, a little transporter that will go and it'll soak up the serotonin that it spat out and just bring it back to the axon. And then if the nerve cell is going to fire again, it can just reuse those serotonin molecules to spit out and give the communication to the next cell. So your body doesn't really need to manufacture anymore. It could just, it's like a baton that someone's, you're giving to the next person in the relay race. After the relay race is over, is it necessary to break the baton in half and manufacture new batons, to use in next relay races, or you could just reuse them? So you have someone, go and take the baton away. So that would be, what a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor does in that system, it blocks that little transporter, it blocks that reuptake mechanism. So what happens is, if your body's not taking up, if the axon's not taking up the serotonin into the axon terminal anymore, more serotonin stays in the synapse longer. So the effect of serotonin is kind of amplified because it kind of chunks it up. It chunks up the transporter. So your body's not producing more serotonin, but it's letting it sit in the synapse longer, which actually has the same effect as if your body was producing more serotonin. So that's how SSRIs work. They block the reuptake protein that shuttles serotonin back into the axon to be reused. So serotonin stays in the synapse for longer. And that's all it is. In terms of how that works for relieving depression or anxiety, that's a little more complicated, and that's what doctors actually, they're just hypotheses out there of how that can alleviate depression, or what mechanism, what does that do in the brain to alleviate depression? So there are different theories. So one of the most popular ones, like I said in the Zoloft commercial with the blobs, and that's the monoamine theory, which basically says depression or anxiety is a chemical imbalance. There's a deficit, or there's a deficiency in the serotonin signaling system. There's not enough serotonin. You need more serotonin, or you need more norepinephrine, and so that's the monoamine theory. There's not a lot of evidence for that. Just it's a nice way to think about how antidepressants work. It's a neat, nice theory. Here's a deficiency. Take that. It's almost like a diabetic taking insulin because their insulin making cells are damaged, right? So if there's damage and there's less insulin, so just take more insulin. So antidepressants also, it's a palatable hypothesis, but there are other probably more likely ones. The more likely one that they're now looking at is the neurotrophic hypothesis. So they believe that the serotonin system influences the production of something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this is a factor, it's a chemical, it's a molecule that gets shuttled around, and actually, everyone, it's been, you hear about this this thing that your brain is, if you damage your brain, that's it, right? Like there's, you damage a cell, it dies right away, that the brain is just kind of constant thing. However, there's neuroplasticity, which is now bashing through that whole concept, which basically says the brain is remolding itself all the time. It's the connections are being shifted and making, in the neurons themselves, are making new connections, and so they believe a lot of the director who's shifting things around are these neurotrophic factors, these growth factors in the brain, and they think serotonin influences these growth factors. So really, it's strange to think about it, but the antidepressants are actually changing physical things in your brain. But don't freak out about that, that antidepressants are going to have long-term effects, because the truth is your brain is always doing that all the time. Any thought you have, your brain is going to be shifting those dendrites all over the place. Your brain is constantly plastic. If you look at the cells, it's almost like a bag of worms, and they're all moving around and making new connections. So yes, antidepressants do cause physical changes in the brain, but so do your daily thoughts, right? A good metaphor I always think of for how the brain can kind of shift around is, I always think of in the Harry Potter movie, like where their dormitories are in this huge, like, this huge hall, and all the stairs are being shifted around in different floors and moving around. So I don't know, I like that kind of visual, to imagine how neuroplasticity is, that things are constantly breaking off and getting new connections. It's not, things aren't really static, they're always moving about. So this is the neurotrophic hypothesis, and it's studies about brain plasticity, and plasticity is a hot topic now. So another thing, it also accounts for the time delay that SSRIs need to be effective. When you take an SSRI, you think, okay, I'm going to start feeling better the next day, but you're not. It actually takes 2 to 4 weeks or longer to feel the effects of SSRIs, and that also lends to the neurotrophic hypothesis, or the plasticity hypothesis, because the drug is influencing your serotonin system a couple of hours after you take the drug, right? So if the monoamine hypothesis is true, you should almost feel relief within a few hours, right? Because it's influencing that system, it's boosting the effects of serotonin, but it doesn't. Why does it take 2 to 4 weeks for changes to be noted? Well, that points to the neurotrophic hypothesis, because changes in the brain, they do take time. I mean, changes on a mass scale, which will actually, which SSRIs will cause, take time to manifest, 2 to 4 weeks. So, that might be one of the reasons for the rather large time delay. So that's how SSRIs work. I apologize if I'm missing any information. So now I'm just going to go over side effects, the different kinds of SSRIs, pros and cons. So, like I said, the first SSRI that came about was Prozac in 1989. Or 1987, forgive me, I don't know the date, but it's more than a decade ago. So this is Fluoxetine, or Prozac, and that got a lot of media coverage, and everyone knows Prozac. So Prozac stays in your system a long time. Its half-life is the time it takes for half of the amount of drug that you took to be metabolized, is a couple of weeks. I think it's a week or something, right? So that's a long time to stay in your system. That means after you stop, if you take the drug for a time and you all of a sudden stop, that drug is still going to be in your system for a couple of weeks. So this long half-life is good in the sense that there's almost no withdrawal with Prozac. I mean, there still is, but it's not nearly as bad as the withdrawal from other antidepressants. But that also means it takes even more time to build up to therapeutic levels in your system. And once you're at that therapeutic level, then on top of that, it's going to take 2 to 4 weeks for the antidepressant effects to work. So Prozac is it takes a while. But it's a good drug if you're not really med compliant. If you forget a couple of days, or you forgot to take it at exactly 9 o'clock every morning. It's a good med for that, because just with the long half-life, you could actually skip a day without noticing really the effects. It's just that long and slow to get out of your system. So it's good if you're not very med compliant and you're forgetful. On top of that, now they have Prozac weekly, which is this time-released pill, which actually lasts all week. If you can imagine an antidepressant that you need to take once per week. It's interesting stuff. So yeah, Prozac weekly. So I'll go through the others before just addressing general side effects. The next one is Paxil. Paxil is the opposite of Prozac. Paxil's half-life is either 24 hours or a little less than 24 hours. So as I was saying with Prozac, that I mentioned that there wasn't much of a withdrawal. I'll talk about withdrawal syndrome right now. So when you stop an SSRI, it's not that easy. You can't just stop and decide one day to not take it. You will notice some pretty uncomfortable effects, and it depends on which SSRI, but these effects can be really, really crappy. And they probably lend to the image of antidepressant addiction, which really isn't. You don't really crave the antidepressant, but you feel so crappy when you're withdrawing from it, you just want to go back on it so you could just function the next day. So it's this mechanism that it's addictive, but it's really just trying to avoid the withdrawal. So you need to titrate down very carefully when you're getting off an antidepressant over weeks or even over months, depending on which kind of antidepressant. For instance, the next one I'm going to talk about, Paxil, is probably the worst antidepressant to get off of. Why? Is because, like I said, the half-life is 24 or even less than 24 hours, which means all of a sudden your brain is just going to be thrown off into the deep end, saying, I don't have this drug anymore. I still need to maintain these brain changes that the SSRIs caused over so many months. I'm left without it. I'm going to start, making me feel like crap. And these withdrawal symptoms are really, really ugly. It's like a really, really bad flu. You'll have mood swings. You'll be really weepy. You're going to have nightmares. You're going to have this weird kind of headache, dizziness, nausea, dizziness, and these electric shock sensations called brain zaps. And it feels like someone opened your skull and dragged a static blanket across. You get these kind of jolts, and they go down your spine, and they kind of go into your arm. And there's an accompanying like vroom, vroom, or like boom, boom. There's like a little kick to it whenever it happens. If also to induce them, if your eyes go back and forth like this during withdrawal, that'll induce like 20 at a time, like when you do that. I withdrew from an antidepressant called Lexapro, or Cipralex, or Citalopram rather quickly. I probably am the only person who found brain zaps kind of cool. I actually enjoyed them. I didn't enjoy the return of anxiety or the headaches, but I found the brain zaps, I don't know, kind of interesting. They weren't painful. You hear people saying that, they were excruciating brain zaps. Like, it sounds like someone's being like electrocuted, like it's painful. But they were just more a strange sensation than anything else. So I didn't notice. It wasn't so painful for me. But the other things, the return of anxiety or the return of sadness, hits you like a flood. It's like after all those years of pent up relief that antidepressants cause you, all come crashing down, and just the bottle is, the cork is popped open now, and all the good part about antidepressants just come raging forth in this this flood of anxiety and depression and mood swings. So nevertheless, like I said, it's pretty ugly withdrawing off an antidepressant. You got to withdraw very, very carefully, slowly titrate down over weeks or months. You can also get a liquid formulation, for your antidepressant. Hopefully there's a corresponding liquid formulation, and with the liquid you're allowed to make tiny little dose changes and go down very, very slowly, rather than splitting up your pills, which result in rather large skips and jumps in dose. And you'll notice, the withdrawal effects at each dose adjustment. But when you have the liquid formulation, you're allowed to do it in very, very small increments, so it's very controlled. You have to be really, really thorough with it. It's a big deal. If you want to get off it, you need to make a plan. You need to do some calculations and really feel, at each dose adjustment, that if you want to go on, you need to make a plan to get off antidepressants. It depends on which one. Like I'm going to be talking about. Some you might not even notice. Some are worse than others, but it's generally a big deal. So like I said, Paxil is probably the worst for this. Short half-life. It gets a lot of bad news coverage, this Paxil drug, because it was probably, it was the antidepressant after Prozac that people started noticing discontinuation syndrome, right? Like I said, Prozac has a long half-life, so when people withdrew from Prozac, it's, the side effects weren't that noticeable. However, Paxil, the next SSRI was, since it was the opposite of Prozac and people withdraw from it, then everything blew up, right? Then they were attributing discontinuation directly to Paxil, right? Whereas it's actually the whole SSRI class of drugs. It just depends on the half-life and some other features of the drug. So Paxil got a lot of bad media coverage. It's a good drug. It's prescribed a lot for people with anxiety spectrum disorders. It was I think it was the first drug indicated for. Officially indicated for social anxiety disorder. It's one of the more sedating SSRIs. SSRIs, they usually are activating, so you normally take them in the morning. But with Paxil, also known as Seroxat in UK, and under the generic brand Fluoxetine, it's actually one of the SSRIs that you could actually take it at night if it gets you drowsy. Paxil is also a little messy. It makes you think of some tricyclics, but not nearly as messy as tricyclics. It does touch muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, so you do get some side effects with Paxil that you don't really get with the others that are more selective or hit different receptors. Since it hits muscarinic receptors, you can get dry mouth. It also might cause constipation or diarrhea. On the sheet it says either one. So, but generally it's pretty constipating because of the muscarinic effects. What else? Maybe some minor urinary retention. And dilated pupils because of the muscarinic, once again, acetylcholine, and drowsiness. Drowsiness could be a problem. That's why I said people generally take it at night. So I think after Paxil came Luvox or fluvoxamine, which I don't know much about except that it has a lot of drug interactions. Like I would go in the patient information sheet or the drug monograph and I would look at other drugs, and almost always there's going to be this Luvox Interactions, Luvox, fluvoxamine. It's an inhibitor of a cytochrome P oxidase in the lungs and in the liver, and any other drug that's going to be metabolized by this enzyme, you're going to have increased blood levels or decreased blood levels of this other drug. So I don't think doctors prescribe it much anymore, just because if that's the only drug you're on, then I guess there's not much of a danger, but it's a really messy drug in terms of interactions. I think it works well. It supposedly works great for OCD specifically, but like I said, I don't know too much about it other than seeing it everywhere and seeing it being listed as an interaction with I don't know how many drugs now. Next is citalopram. Citalopram and its relative S-citalopram are very, very selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They have a high affinity for the serotonin receptors, and they generally do not touch much else. Paxil touches the muscarinic. The citalopram and escitalopram are very clean, just serotonin. They go right to it. There's no weak binding affinities for any other receptors, or if there are, it's extremely mild. These are good SSRIs. They're a good first line treatment. Citalopram is, you should generally try citalopram out, and then if not, maybe upgrade to a more potent one like Paxil or escitalopram, which I said is relative citalopram. But these are pretty good SSRIs for first line treatment. Escitalopram is an excellent example of drug evergreening. So Lundbeck, the makers of citalopram, after the citalopram patent expired, which would mean a whole bunch of money lost for Lundbeck, they decided to do something to citalopram and market it again as a new antidepressant. What they did is, okay, so citalopram, the molecule, if you were to zoom in really closely to the pill, constitutes you'll see it's split up between two molecules. And although they have the exact same atoms on them, their arrangement is slightly different. So this is called chirality. You could say this drug is a racemic mixture. It has a mixture of two of the natural forms of citalopram, specifically the left and right form of the drug. So, I mean, it's hard. I'm not going to go into it much, but imagine that citalopram comes in left and right handed drugs, and if you have a left and right handed drug, you can't superimpose them. So what Lundbeck figured out was that it's only 1/2 of citalopram that you take that actually has the affinity for the serotonin receptor. So they say, okay, well, let's not make a whole new compound. Let's just take our citalopram stash and just separate out the left and right hands and only give the effective one. And that's where S-citalopram comes from. They just stuck an S in front because for organic chemistry, I think the S means basically one of the isomers. I forget if it's a left hand or right hand. So instead of citalopram, let's just split it up and call it S-citalopram. So this is an example of evergreening, and now they have a patent for how many more years. I think escitalopram just came off patent. It's also known as Lexapro, but that's a very good example of drug evergreening. But so escitalopram is more potent than citalopram, which makes sense, right? So you get rough estimate: 40 milligrams of citalopram would have 20 milligrams of escitalopram and 20 milligrams of the other isomer citalopram. So for an equivalent in Lexapro or escitalopram, 40 milligrams of citalopram equals 20 milligrams of escitalopram, roughly. So a good example of what some drug companies are doing, and they're splitting up their racemic mixture drugs and marketing it as a new one. But Lexapro is a potent one. It's a good antidepressant. The withdrawal syndrome from Lexapro and citalopram, they're there, but they're not as harsh as Paxil withdrawal. So you still got to be careful with it. And you search YouTube, you're still going to find many videos of people bashing Lexapro. And some people will get the withdrawal effects a lot worse than others. You don't know until you actually do it. Also, escitalopram and citalopram have a relatively low incidence of sexual side effects. Paxil being probably the culprit with the most sexual side effects. In fact, a low dose of Paxil, Fluoxetine, is being used for premature ejaculation, and at therapeutic doses in many men, it causes a complete absence of orgasm. So erections are still possible. Sometimes they lower libido, and sometimes it's almost like a chemical castration, but sometimes they cause just a total lack of ability to have an orgasm. All SSRIs do this to some extent, but for some reason, Paxil seems to be the culprit for the most highest incidence of sexual side effects. The same thing with women too. Anorgasmia, this lack of orgasm that could happen in some people. So you might want to take that into account when choosing antidepressants, Lexapro, Citalopram being, once again, the least influence amongst that side effect. So I believe that's it for SSRIs. So other side effects are generally confined to the first couple of weeks when you start the drug. These include headaches, sometimes insomnia, sometimes drowsiness, like in the case of Paxil. Jaw clenching is a big one for some people. Dizziness when starting up, trembling or tremors sometimes, and also if the dose is too high. And at least for me, I got a couple of times when I wake up in the morning, it feels like there's a pager motor in the middle, inside you. So you're kind of, you're not anxious, but there's kind of like a trembling tremor, and as well your eyes when they're adjusting to the light. So there's almost a little bit of a kind of a strobe effect. This goes away within a couple of weeks. What else? The yawn. These are yawns that happen. You'll be yawning all the time in the first few weeks of SSRIs. You might not even be tired, but whenever you're thinking a new thought, whenever you're changing an activity, you're going to have this really weird, intense yawn. It just happens all the time. So that's all I could think of for SSRIs. Don't be afraid of them. When you go online, you're going to see a whole bunch of controversial stuff and people bashing the class of meds. But you have to realize that the people who are likely to make a video or complain online about the drug are those who are a bad responder to the drug, whereas people who have been helped immensely by the drug don't feel as much desire to go on and complain and rant about the drug. Suffice to say that some people react really, really badly. Paxil, there was a huge lawsuit in 1996 that it caused increased suicidality in children. Kids were committing suicide on the drug. So now there's black box warnings on all SSRIs saying there's a risk of increased suicidality, especially amongst kids under 18. So that was a big thing. They think the mechanism for that was a kind of akathisia or an internal restlessness, which happens it's a very rare startup side effect for SSRIs. But they think some of those suicidal ideation side effects, which are extremely rare, mind you. It's don't be afraid of that. Nevertheless, yes, there needs to be a black box warning on it, right? But exceedingly rare, and doctors note this now. So you have to be monitored carefully on it. It's a funny idea. You'll see commercials and say, it's for depression. They'll be advertising, Zoloft for depression. And they say, there's an increased risk of thoughts of suicide. It's like, well, isn't that exactly what they're trying to treat? But no, it's a rare side effect. But I don't know. It's one of many possible side effects that you can get with any drug, and yeah, it's scary, but it should not scare you away from this whole class of antidepressant, because it's sometimes really valuable and it really changes people's lives sometimes. So it's worth a try. Escalate the dose carefully, and if you notice anything, contact your doctor right away. But yeah, I'll talk briefly about. This video is more than a half an hour, but it's a lot of information. I'll talk briefly about the SNRIs, which are, like I said before, they inhibit the reuptake of both serotonin and norepinephrine, so they have more of a dual action. which if you have non-responders to SSRIs, if the SSRI class of any of the drugs that I told about. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention Zoloft, but it's also very similar to Lexapro. It's sometimes a little more activating because there's a small dopamine action. So with the SNRIs, if the SSRIs have failed you, you could try SNRIs. So these are, there's Effexor, the extended release form, there's Cymbalta, and now there's Prestique. So Effexor is also, the chemical is known as Venlafaxine, and just like what they did with citalopram and escitalopram, Venlafaxine comes in the left and right hand gloved model, and so I think I forget who the manufacturers are. Maybe it's Eli Lilly. What they did is they took the venlafaxine molecule, chopped, separated the left and right hand sides, and they had now, instead of venlafaxine, they have des-venlafaxine. Des is right hand side, dextrous. So once again, now here's a new patent for antidepressant that they can sell for how many years and get billions of dollars of it from it. So Effexor is effective. I don't know much about Cymbalta, but Effexor, I think, has the worst withdrawal effects of any antidepressant drug. I'm not going to say much about it, but I knew someone who, when he wanted to withdraw from Effexor, he actually opened the capsule, and inside the capsule, the time-release capsule, the Effexor molecules are contained within these tiny little beads or spheres. So I forget how many hundreds of these beads are in one of these gelatin capsules that you could open up. So my friend actually opened up the capsule and counted out all the beads to see how many there were in the average capsule, and then had a titration schedule where he took a capsule with one bead less per day. So it took a couple of months, but that's a very, very smooth withdrawal. But that's the kind of thing you need to do to get off these SSRI drugs. Many people have tried cold turkey, and sometimes they're forced to to go off the drug cold turkey. Either they forget to pick up a prescription, or their doctor's away and they didn't get refills. So people do get off of it cold turkey, but it's time and time again they say it is one of the worst experiences of their lives. So be careful about getting off these drugs. Effexor and Paxil are probably the worst contenders in terms of withdrawal. The other ones, you still have to be cautious about, but not nearly as cautious. Talk with your doctor. Get liquid formulations if that helps. Also, another thing people are doing is, if you want to get off, let's say, Paxil, what people do is they stop taking the Paxil and they take Prozac very quickly. And since Prozac has a longer half-life, now they're on a new SSRI, and now they could slowly wean down on Prozac. And since Prozac has, like I was saying, the long half-life, it's a smoother withdrawal because it slowly goes out of your system. So that's another option, to change to an SSRI with a longer half-life and taper off of that. And the long half-life basically does the titration for you to some extent. So that's it. I think that's all I know about SSRIs. So it's a long video, but if any of you wanted a crash course on SSRIs, maybe it was appropriate, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions about antidepressants or SSRIs or SNRIs, I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Thanks for watching.